When I turned off the old dirt road and saw my cabin covered in no trespassing signs, I thought I had the wrong property. But then I saw the oak tree, the one my father carved our initials into, and realized the HOA had claimed my home as their own. My name is Daniel Harper, and this was supposed to be the day I finally came home. 3 years ago, a wildfire ripped through these mountains like a monster made of flame and wind. It devoured everything in its path: the old pine trees, the wooden fences, the shed my father built by hand, and nearly me along with it. I remember standing on the ridge, helpless as the fire swallowed the valley I'd grown up in. After the smoke cleared, I left. I told myself it would be temporary, just until I could afford to rebuild. But life had other plans. I took contract work as a surveyor in the city, buried myself in maps and measurements, and tried not to think about what I'd lost. Still, somewhere in the back of my mind, the cabin called to me, the way home always does. When I finally drove back up that winding mountain road, the world felt both familiar and strange. The trees had grown back thicker than before, green and alive. The air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. Every curve in the road brought back memories. My father teaching me to drive, my mother sitting on the porch with her morning coffee, the sound of rain hitting the tin roof at night. For a moment, I felt like I was returning to the life I'd left behind, but that illusion shattered the moment. I saw the gate. The entrance to my land had once been marked by a hand-carved sign that read Harper's Rest, a simple piece of cedar. My dad had sanded smooth and nailed between 2 posts. Now it was gone. In its place stood a polished metal sign that gleamed in the sunlight. Mountain View Estates. HOA community rules enforced. I frowned, thinking it must be some mistake. My cabin sat on an independent lot, miles from the nearest subdivision. There had never been an HOA here. Just a few old families, some weekend hunters, and people who wanted to be left alone. Yet here I was, staring at a locked steel gate, fresh asphalt on the driveway, and a dozen bright red no trespassing signs plastered across the fence. For a second I wondered if I'd taken a wrong turn, but then I saw the oak tree near the creek, the same tree my father carved our initials into when I was 12. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was my land. I parked my truck and climbed out, heart pounding with confusion and anger. Before I could even approach the cabin, I heard a voice behind me, sharp, cold, and full of authority. "Excuse me. You can't be here." I turned and saw her. A woman in her late 50s marched toward me from the neighboring lot, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her posture was rigid, her clothes spotless, pastel blouse, pressed slacks, and a little HOA badge pinned neatly to her chest. Everything about her screamed control. "You're trespassing," she declared before I could speak. "This is private property, HOA managed land." For a moment I was too stunned to answer. Then I took a slow breath and said, "Ma'am, this is my property. My name is Daniel Harper. I bought this cabin from my father in 2015. She raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "That's impossible. Every home in this area falls under Mountain View HOA jurisdiction. If you don't have a resident permit or HOA ID, you'll need to leave immediately." I stepped closer, trying to stay calm. "There must be a mistake. My deed—" "There's no mistake," she interrupted, already scribbling something on her clipboard. "We've maintained this area for years. You can contact our office if you have a complaint. The address is on the sign." Then, just like that, she turned and walked away, like I was some trespasser interrupting her afternoon checklist. I stood there in silence, watching her disappear behind the neighbor's fence, feeling the kind of slow, heavy anger that comes when someone touches what's yours. My land, my father's legacy, my home. That evening, I drove down to the county office with my deed in hand. The clerk, a young woman who looked exhausted from a long day, scanned the document, then frowned. "Your parcel is under administrative review," she said softly. "Administrative review?" I repeated. "Who's reviewing my property?" She hesitated. "That would be the Mountain View HOA Legal Committee." "And who's on that committee?" I asked. She glanced at her computer screen and sighed. "President Linda Monroe." So that was her name. Linda Monroe. The clipboard queen herself. I pressed for details, but she couldn't tell me much more. According to their records, the HOA had expanded its community boundary 2 years ago after a land integration vote. They'd filed new easements and claimed maintenance responsibility for nearby parcels, including mine. Apparently, during my 3-year absence, they'd quietly reclassified my road as community access property. And since I hadn't responded to their mailed notices, in which, of course, I never received, they'd treated my lot as unclaimed land under review. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was sinking behind the ridge, the forest was bathed in gold light, and for a second I almost forgot how angry I was. This place was still beautiful, and scarred, yes, but still alive. I decided I wasn't leaving again. Not tonight, not ever. I unlocked the door, dusted off the old porch chair, and sat watching the valley below as the crickets started to sing. It felt good to be home again, even if the world had changed around me. But the peace didn't last long. When I woke up the next morning, something felt off. The forest was quiet and too quiet. I stepped outside, and that's when I saw it. A piece of paper nailed right through the front door, fluttering slightly in the wind. I pulled it down and read, "Violation notice, unauthorized occupancy of HOA property. Immediate eviction required. Signed, Linda Monroe, President, Mountain View Estates HOA." I froze. My eyes drifted to the bottom of the page, and my stomach dropped. Stapled beneath the notice was a printed photo of me, sleeping on my own porch. Someone had been here last night. Someone had taken that photo while I was inside unaware. I stared at the image, my hands shaking, a mix of anger and disbelief boiling in my chest. This wasn't about community rules or property maintenance. This was personal. Linda Monroe wasn't protecting anything. She was taking it. She had crossed the line from authority into obsession. That was the exact moment I decided. I wasn't backing down. I wasn't going to let some clipboard-wielding bully rewrite history and steal my family's legacy. They might have taken the signs, the road, and the paperwork, but they hadn't taken the truth. What Linda Monroe didn't know was that before the fire, before everything, I had worked as a licensed land surveyor for the county. I knew how property lines worked, every coordinate, every boundary, every inch of soil that belonged to me. If they'd forged documents or redrawn borders, I would find it. And when I did, I'd make sure the law, not the HOA, had the final word. I looked around the cabin one last time that morning. The walls still smelled faintly of smoke. The porch creaked under my boots, and the hills beyond glowed in the first light of dawn. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I was going to fight for it no matter how ugly it got. Linda Monroe had just started a war she couldn't win, and I was ready to fight it, one boundary line at a time. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the porch with a mug of black coffee, staring at the creek as moonlight shimmered across the water. Every so often, I'd glance at that violation notice lying on the table beside me. The word eviction burned into my mind like a scar. Someone had taken a photo of me on my own porch. That meant they'd come onto my land in the dark. That meant Linda Monroe wasn't just bluffing. She was watching me, and if there's one thing I can't stand, it's being watched on land that carries my family's name. I thought about my father that night, how he used to say that land wasn't just something you owned, it was something you protected. I could almost hear his voice in the wind, the same steady tone he used when teaching me to drive stakes into the soil, marking the lines that separated ours from theirs. "A man's boundary isn't where the fence stands, Danny," he'd say. "It's where he's willing to stand and defend it." The next morning, I loaded up my truck and drove straight to the Ridgeview County Records office. The same young clerk from yesterday gave me a nervous smile when she saw me walk in, holding my deed like it was a shield. "Back again?" she asked. I nodded. "I need every map, zoning document, and survey record for this area, specifically Mountain View Estates, and any expansions they've filed in the last 3 years. She hesitated, but eventually pointed me to a row of file drawers in the back. "Help yourself," she said quietly. "Just be careful. You're not the first one to ask about them." That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" She looked around, lowering her voice. "You didn't hear this from me, but the HOA's been aggressive. They've been trying to push out old owners for months. People who don't fit the image, they say." I thanked her and started digging. Hours passed. Paper after paper, map after map, until my eyes blurred from staring at lines and coordinates. Then I saw something strange. On a 2023 subdivision map, the HOA boundary extended far past the original zoning line, swallowing up a dozen private parcels, including mine. But here's the thing. The approval stamp on the document belonged to a county surveyor named James L. Porter. And I remembered Porter. He'd retired in 2021, 2 years before this map was filed. I felt the first flicker of real anger twist in my gut. This wasn't an error. This was fraud. Someone had forged Porter's signature to make the expansion look legitimate. That's when I knew this wasn't just about me. It was about control. The HOA had built their empire on lies, and if they could take my land, they could take anyone's. By noon, I'd filled an entire folder with copies, notes, and photos. Before leaving, I turned back to the clerk and said, "If anyone asks, you didn't help me." She gave a quick nod, her eyes wide with understanding. "Be careful, Mr. Harper," she whispered. "People who go up against them don't usually win." When I got back to the cabin, there was a shiny white SUV parked near the gate. A man in a blazer was waiting beside it, arms crossed, HOA badge clipped to his chest. He smiled when he saw me. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Mr. Harper," he said smoothly. "Glad I caught you. Can I help you?" I asked. "I'm with Mountain View Estates' legal compliance team. We've received reports that you're refusing to vacate HOA-managed property." I laughed, though there was nothing funny about it. "That's because it's not HOA property. It's mine," he sighed, pulling out a clipboard. "Look, Daniel, I'm just here to help resolve this peacefully. But if you keep ignoring the rules, we'll have to escalate." I leaned against my truck, arms folded. "Escalate? You mean call the sheriff?" His smirk returned. "We don't call the sheriff. We call code enforcement." The way he said it made my skin crawl. He was confident, too confident, like he already knew the system was on his side. Sure enough, 2 days later, a county inspector showed up at my door with a list of violations as long as my arm. Unapproved structure, unsafe foundation, non-compliant fencing, even unauthorized well use. Every single one of them was fake, and right behind him stood Linda Monroe, watching like a queen surveying her kingdom. When the inspector left, I confronted her. "You forged county documents," I said, holding up the copied map I'd found. "You're expanding your control illegally." Her expression didn't even flicker. "Mr. Harper, if you have complaints, you're welcome to bring them to our next HOA meeting." "Oh, I will," I said, "and I'm bringing the law with me." She just smiled. "Good luck with that." That night, I called an old friend, Marcia Keller, a property lawyer I'd worked with years ago on a boundary dispute case. When I told her what was happening, she didn't even hesitate. "Fax me everything you've got," she said. "If they forged a county signature, that's felony fraud. We can burn them to the ground legally." Over the next week, I collected everything: coordinates, photos, witness statements from old neighbors, and even footage from a hunter's trail camera that showed HOA contractors crossing onto private property to replace signs. I mapped out every inch of my boundary using my old surveying tools, the same ones I'd once used for county work. By the time I was done, I had a mountain of proof and a solid case. But Linda wasn't done playing games. A few days later, I came home to find someone had dumped gravel across my driveway, sealing off the only access road with a makeshift berm. There was another note pinned to it: HOA property, no access without authorization. That's when I stopped playing nice. I rented a small bulldozer from town, cleared the road myself, and put up a new sign at the entrance. A large wooden board that read, "Private property, not HOA land. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I half expected Linda to show up in a rage that evening. Instead, something better happened. 2 men in suits arrived, county investigators. Apparently, Marcia had already filed the complaint with the State Land Survey Board and the county attorney's office, including the forged signature evidence. They spent hours at my cabin reviewing the paperwork, taking statements, and comparing the documents I'd collected to the official county archives. The conclusion was clear. The HOA had submitted falsified maps to extend their jurisdiction. It was one of the worst cases of property manipulation they'd ever seen. Still, I knew Linda wouldn't back down easily. People like her didn't know how to lose. She'd built her little empire on power, fear, and paperwork, the kind that crushed anyone who didn't have the money or patience to fight back. But I had both. And more importantly, I had truth. I decided to take the fight public. I called a local news outlet, a small station known for covering corruption stories, and told them everything. At first, they sounded skeptical. But when I mentioned forged county signatures and homeowners being bullied off their own land, They sent a crew up within 48 hours. When the news van pulled up, Linda was already pacing near the gate, red-faced and flustered. She hadn't expected this. The reporter, a sharp young woman named Sarah Patel, started filming immediately. "Mrs. Monroe," she began, "is it true that your HOA illegally extended its boundaries to include privately owned properties?" Linda straightened, forcing a smile. "That's absolutely false. Mr. Harper is confused about ownership rights. Our HOA simply enforces community standards to maintain property values." Sarah tilted her head. "According to county records, Mr. Harper's deed predates your HOA by 6 years." The silence that followed was golden. Cameras zoomed in on Linda's face as the color drained from her cheeks. I didn't even have to say a word. I just stood behind her, arms crossed, holding my original deed like a badge of honor. The county investigators stepped forward next, holding copies of the forged documents. "Mrs. Monroe," one of them said, "your signature appears on every single illegal filing. Care to explain?" Linda stammered, her confident mask cracking for the first time. That's a misunderstanding. I didn't, but it was too late." The sheriff's department, already alerted by the state attorney's office, pulled up right then. Sirens silent, lights flashing. 2 deputies stepped out, walked over to Linda Monroe, and read her rights. She screamed about property values and community integrity as they cuffed her hands and led her to the car. The camera crew captured everything, and the moment went viral online before the sun even set. That night, as the sky turned orange over the mountain ridge, I sat on the porch again, the same spot where all this had started. The creek flowed steady below and the air smelled of pine and freedom. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a trespasser. I felt like the rightful owner of my home again. The war wasn't completely over, not yet. There were still hearings to attend, fines to sort through, and the HOA board to dismantle. But I'd won the hardest battle, proving that the land was mine, that truth still mattered, and that even the most powerful liar could fall when faced with someone who refused to back down. I raised my mug of coffee toward the fading light and whispered, "Here's to you, Dad. The lines are still where you drew them." The mountain stayed quiet, but in that silence I could almost swear I heard him answer, the low, proud echo of a man who taught his son that home is worth fighting for. After Linda Monroe's arrest, the mountain grew strangely quiet. For a few days, there were no more white SUVs parked near my gate, no more fresh notices nailed to my door. The no trespassing signs started to fade under the rain, curling at the edges like defeated soldiers. But I knew better than to think it was over. People like Linda never give up control willingly. They find new ways to claw their power back. And sure enough, a week later, I got a letter from the Mountain View Estates legal counsel. It was thick, 20 pages of legal jargon, printed on glossy letterhead with a silver HOA emblem at the top. The first line made my jaw tighten. "Dear Mr. Harper, despite recent misunderstandings, you remain in violation of multiple community covenants under Article 14, Section 9 of the Mountain View Estates Charter." Misunderstandings. That was their word for trespassing, forgery, and fraud. They weren't backing down. They were regrouping. The letter threatened civil litigation, demanded I remove unauthorized signage, and warned that defamation of the HOA and media outlets will result in further legal action. I almost laughed. They were bluffing. They'd been exposed on live television, the president arrested, and yet they still had the audacity to threaten me. I called Marcia that night. She picked up on the first ring. "Let me guess," she said. "They're trying to scare you again." "Exactly," I replied, handing the letter toward the speakerphone like she could see it. She chuckled softly. "Then it's time to set the trap." That phrase, "we set the trap," stuck with me. We'd gathered evidence, exposed Linda publicly, but now we needed to seal the case airtight so it couldn't be buried under red tape. Marcia explained her plan in that calm, methodical tone lawyers use when they know they're holding a royal flush. The HOA's charter and boundary filings had been altered with a forged signature. That alone was criminal. But if we could connect it to financial gain, illegal dues, misappropriated funds, it would turn into a full-scale fraud investigation. Over the next 2 weeks, I became both landowner and detective. Every morning, I drove into town with folders of paperwork, meeting county clerks, code officers, even a retired surveyor who had once worked under Porter. the man whose name had been forged. The old surveyor was in his 70s, thin as a rake, with calloused hands that still smelled faintly of pine tar. When I showed him the 2023 map, he squinted for a long moment before shaking his head. "This ain't Porter's signature," he said. "He always looped the J lower, see here? Whoever did this tried too hard." He signed an affidavit confirming it. That single page, written in ink by a man who'd spent 40 years drawing the truth into the earth, was the nail in the coffin. Meanwhile, Marcia was building the legal case brick by brick. She discovered that the HOA had been collecting maintenance dues from residents for repairs that never happened. Roads were untouched, drainage systems left clogged, yet thousands of dollars had disappeared from their budget. The funds, as it turned out, were redirected to a company called Clear Ridge Development, owned by, you guessed it, Linda Monroe's brother. When Marcia called to tell me, I remember sitting in my truck, gripping the steering wheel as the mountain wind howled outside. "You're telling me," I said slowly, "they stole land and laundered money through a fake construction company?" She laughed softly. "Congratulations, Daniel. You're not just a homeowner fighting an HOA. You're the whistleblower in a full-blown racketeering case. We gathered everything: forged maps, fraudulent invoices, false easements, and even the HOA's own internal emails, leaked by a disillusioned former board member who reached out anonymously after seeing the news broadcast. He said Linda had bullied people into silence for years, threatening fines or foreclosures if they questioned her authority. She thought she was untouchable, he told me. You proved she wasn't. When we had enough evidence to crush an empire, Marcia called the county attorney's office and arranged a formal presentation. She insisted I come too. "You deserve to see it happen," she said. That morning I wore my cleanest flannel and boots that still had mud on the soles, because I wanted them to remember that this case wasn't about papers or policies. It was about the dirt beneath my feet, the land my family had protected for generations. The conference room was bright and cold, filled with lawyers, investigators, and one very nervous HOA representative. Marcia spoke for nearly an hour, laying out every detail: the forged surveyor's signature, the illegal boundary expansion, the missing funds, the extortion letters. She spoke with precision, each word a nail hammered straight into the heart of their lies. When she finished, the county attorney leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "Well, Mr. Harper," he said, turning to me, "looks like your mountain's about to be a free land again." A week later, the state attorney general's office filed criminal charges against multiple HOA board members. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement, the list ran long. Linda Monroe, already out on bail, was rearrested on new counts of racketeering. Her empire of intimidation crumbled overnight, but I wasn't done. I wanted closure, not revenge, just truth out in the open. So when the local news reached out for a follow-up story, I agreed. They came back to the cabin, cameras rolling, to film an interview about the case. I told them everything. How the HOA forged maps, bullied landowners, and tried to erase history. I showed them the oak tree with my father's initials, the old deed, the fresh survey stakes I'd planted to mark the real boundary. As we talked, the camera panned across the property, the cabin, the creek, the fading "no trespassing" sign still nailed to the fence. It looked peaceful now, but I could feel the ghosts of every fight I'd endured here. Sarah, the reporter, asked one last question. "What would you say to homeowners watching this who feel powerless against their HOA?" I paused, staring past the camera at the horizon. The same ridge where the wildfire had burned years ago, now green again. "I'd tell them," I said slowly, "that power only works when you let people think they own it. You draw your lines, you stand on them, and you don't move, not even an inch, because the moment you give in, they'll take everything." The next morning, I woke to find my phone flooded with messages, strangers thanking me, neighbors sharing their own HOA horror stories, and even a few local officials quietly admitting they'd been waiting for someone to challenge the system. What had started as one man's fight for his cabin had turned into something bigger, a symbol, a spark. A week later, the county held a public hearing to dissolve Mountain View Estates HOA entirely. Residents voted unanimously to terminate the association, citing corruption, fraud, and abuse of power. Watching that vote felt surreal, like watching a monster disintegrate in daylight. The same people who'd once feared Linda Monroe now cheered as the final motion passed. Afterward, Marcia joined me at the cabin to celebrate. We sat by the fire, sipping cheap whiskey, listening to the crackle of the logs. "You know," she said, "most people would have given up. You didn't." I smiled, staring into the flames. "I couldn't. This land, it's part of me." She nodded. "Then I'd say you and the mountain both finally got justice." The wind outside picked up, rustling through the trees, and I couldn't help but think it sounded like the forest itself was exhaling. Relieved. Alive. Free again. The next morning, I walked down to the creek with a hammer and a new wooden plaque I'd carved myself. I nailed it to the front gate where the HOA sign used to hang. Harper's Rest, an established 1954 private property. No HOA, no trespassing on freedom. As the sunlight hit the sign, I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace, the real kind, the kind that doesn't need permission. The paper war was over. The land was mine again. And the mountain finally belonged to the Harpers, just like it always should have. When the mountain finally went quiet, it was almost strange. For 3 years I had lived in a storm of legal battles, trespassing notices, and the constant hum of tension that seemed to echo through the pines. Now the silence felt like something sacred. The air smelled of pine sap and wet soil, the kind of scent that takes you back decades in a single breath. I woke before sunrise that morning, out of habit. Old soldiers and old landowners share that curse, the inability to sleep when there's peace. The cabin was warm with the soft glow of the fireplace, and the light coming through the window spilled across the old map on my table, the real map, the one my father had drawn by hand in the 1970s. I traced the borders with my finger, smiling faintly at the faded ink. Every ridge, every stream, every oak tree was there, drawn with care and pride. It wasn't just land. It was memory inked on paper. I brewed coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The boards creaked under my boots the same way they had when I was a kid, sneaking out before dawn to watch the deer graze. The fog still hugged the trees, and the first light of morning painted the valley in soft gold. My father used to call this hour the breath of the mountain, that fragile moment before the world wakes. For the first time in years, it felt like the mountain was breathing easy again. Down by the old fence line, the no trespassing signs the HOA had hammered into my land were gone. I'd taken them down myself one by one and burned them in the fire pit. In their place, the wooden plaque I carved, Harper's Rest, stood proud and clean. It wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. That morning, I decided it was time to rebuild, not just the land, but the life I'd put on hold for too long. I started with the cabin. The porch needed new beams, the roof had a few leaks, and the garden that my mother once tended had turned wild with weeds. I worked slow, steady the way my father taught me. Every nail, every cut of wood felt like reclaiming something I'd lost. When the hammer struck, it wasn't just building, it was healing. By mid-afternoon, the sound of an engine pulled me out of my rhythm. A familiar old Jeep crawled up the dirt road. Marcia. She stepped out holding a box and grinning wide. "I brought something," she said, setting it on the porch. Inside were stacks of papers neatly bound together. "What's all this?" I asked. She smiled. "Freedom in legal form. The court finalized the land restoration. The county recorded your property line exactly as it was before the HOA tampered with it. It's official, Daniel. It's all yours again." I stood there for a moment staring at the papers. It was strange how something so small, so light, could carry the weight of a war. I reached out, thumb brushing across the first page where it read, "Owner of record, Daniel Harper." "Guess we did it," I said softly. Marcia laughed. "You did it. I just made sure the system didn't get in your way." We spent the rest of the afternoon sitting on the porch, watching the sun drop behind the ridge. For the first time since meeting her, neither of us talked about laws or evidence or court hearings. We talked about life, her growing law firm, my plans to restore the cabin, the trout that still ran thick in the creek. It felt almost normal. As the last light faded, she stood to leave. "You know," she said, "most people who go through something like this end up selling. Moving on." I shook my head. "I've moved on before. Didn't like where it took me." She smiled knowingly. "Then you're right where you belong." When her Jeep disappeared down the hill, the mountain grew quiet again. I looked up at the stars, the same ones I used to count as a boy lying in the grass beside my father. It hit me then, this wasn't just about land or justice. It was about legacy, My father had built this cabin with his own hands. My mother had planted the apple trees by the creek, and when they passed, I'd promised to keep it safe. Somewhere along the line, I'd let that promise fade under the noise of the world. But now here I was, keeping it again. The following days fell into a peaceful rhythm. I fixed the barn roof, cleared fallen branches from the path, and rebuilt the old dock by the river. Word spread fast in town that the Harper property was free land again. Old neighbors stopped by, bringing pies, tools, even stories about how the HOA had bullied them too. One old man, Mr. Dean, told me quietly, "You didn't just fight for yourself, son. You fought for all of us who were too tired to." That night I couldn't sleep. I stepped outside, drawn by the glow of the moon reflecting off the creek. The air was cold, the kind that bites your lungs but makes you feel alive. I walked down to the water, the same path I'd walked 1,000 times before, and stood there in silence. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the angry, exhausted man who'd returned 3 years ago. It was someone lighter and scarred, sure, but whole. A soft rustle behind me made me turn. A deer stood at the edge of the trees, watching quietly. It didn't run. For a moment, man and nature just existed side by side like old neighbors finally at peace. The next morning I started writing again. Not legal documents or letters to the county, just stories. About the land, about my father. About the way justice can sometimes take the shape of a mountain refusing to move. Writing was how I began to understand what really happened. How something as ordinary as an HOA could twist into greed. And how something as simple as a man refusing to back down could untwist it again. A few weeks later, the county sent me an invitation, a small ceremony to officially mark the end of the Mountain View Estates HOA. They wanted me to attend as a community representative. I laughed when I read that. A few months ago they called me a trespasser. Now I was being asked to cut the ribbon on freedom. I went, though, not for pride and for closure. The event was held in front of the old HOA office, now stripped bare, its sign already half taken down. Families gathered, neighbors smiled, and when the county commissioner handed me the scissors, the crowd cheered as the ribbon snapped. Afterward, a little boy, maybe 8 or 9, came up to me and tugged my sleeve. "Mister," he said, "my dad said you made the bad people go away." I smiled. "Not bad people, kid. Just people who forgot what right means." He nodded seriously like he understood and ran back to his parents. That night I drove home with the windows down, the cool mountain air rushing in. When I reached the cabin, I parked by the gate, got out and stood looking up at the stars again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was guarding something. I felt like I was part of it. Over the next month, I opened the cabin to the community, not as an inn, not as a business, just as a place to share stories. Every Sunday, people gathered around the fire pit. Veterans, farmers, teachers, even a few former HOA members who'd apologized and wanted to make things right. We cooked, talked, laughed, and remembered what real community felt like. Not rules written in fine print, but trust built face to face. Sometimes, I'd catch Marcia there too, sitting quietly with a mug of coffee, smiling at the sight of people healing. She'd glance at me and say, "You ever think your fight would turn into this?" "Not once," I'd admit. "Guess justice has a funny way of growing roots," she'd reply. As autumn rolled in, the mountain turned gold again, the same golden blaze I remembered from childhood. The air grew crisp, the river clearer, the nights quieter. And one evening, as I watched the sunset from the porch, it finally sank in. I wasn't living against something anymore. I was living for something. Before heading inside, I took one last look at the wooden sign by the gate, Harper's Rest, established 1954. The letters gleamed in the light. I smiled. My father's promise was safe, and as the sun dipped below the ridge, painting the world in fire and peace, I whispered to the mountain, a quiet vow that only it and I would ever hear. "You're home now, and so am I."